Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to Data Platform Down Under for the month of June. This month, we've got Heidi Hastings and Martin Catherall, both Data Platform MVPs. Martin actually being our co-host of Data Platform Down Under, giving us a session on which Fabric data store is right for you. This session is being recorded and will be placed up on the Data Platform Down Under YouTube channel. If you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, you can, where you can come back and watch not just this session, any other session that we have hosted over the last couple of years. I will look at putting the link to that in the chat window, so you will be able to join up and get notifications when we do have the sessions up there. But as I said, go back and watch previous sessions. If you do have any questions in the session, feel free to put them in the chat. I will be monitoring that for both Heidi and Martin, but I'm sure they will be watching it as well. So we'll be able to get those questions through to them during the session and or at the end of the session. So take the most of your time, ask the questions, and have a fantastic session. So with that, I'll hand over to Martin and Heidi.
Awesome. Thanks, Warwick. I'll just shift the screen over to me. That should all be sharing. Just confirm you can see my screen there.
Yes.
We can indeed, Heidi.
Awesome. So as Warwick said, we're going to be talking about choosing the right data store. Of course, with Fabric, we have a lot of different options available to us. Underneath, it's all going to be the one lake storage, but we wanted to go through the different options and why you might choose one over the other. My name is Heidi Hastings. I'm based in South Australia when I'm home. I'm often traveling the world for different tech events in my annual leave. By day, I do data analytics consulting, stay with all things Microsoft, all things data. I am one of the MVPs and also an MCT as well. And I love playing with all things application lifecycle management. So you often see me talking about Azure DevOps. If you watch the recent Fabric Tech Talk Friday, I was doing from clicks to commits on that one because I love doing source control. And then Martin, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm Martin, like Warwick said before we joined. I host the group along with Warwick, but today I've got the pleasure of presenting with Heidi. So like Heidi, I'm an MVP and an MCT, and have managed to amass quite a few certifications along my data journey, which has been about 20 years or so, taking me from SQL Server on-prem through to Azure and lately on Fabric. So with that, Heidi, should we have a look at the agenda? Okay. So what are we going to look at today? Well, it's all about Fabric data stores. So different types of places where you can store your data, no matter what kind of data you've got, whether it's like natively within Fabric itself or whether it's stored externally. So we're going to have an in-depth look at maybe the native data stores, and we'll touch on some of the external data stores as well. So there's a whole range of things we probably want to consider, and that might be, you know, evaluating the data stores based on the different types of data we've got, whether it's going to be structured or unstructured, whether we've got it coming in really fast in a real-time sense, or whether it's like the more traditional batch approach, like dragging it in with, for instance, what we had SSAS, now it's like Data Factory. And we want to consider things like costs and have a look at those, and also like maintenance and archiving requirements as well. We've got some new types of data storages we can look at too that kind of affect things like visualization and whether it's like a static report or a real-time report. New model called Direct Lake, which if you've already been working with Power BI, you're probably maybe a little bit familiar with, but we'll take a look at that and then we'll just summarize at the end. If anyone's got any questions, hopefully the one who's not talking will be able to answer, but if none of us answer, feel free to come off mute and sing out, or we will get to your question eventually. Oh, so I think that's enough for me. Heidi, do you want to take it away?
Absolutely. So the first thing we wanted to do is make sure that everyone had sort of that foundational knowledge of what is Microsoft Fabric. You're probably bored to death of seeing this slide, but in case you haven't, Microsoft Fabric is that all-in-one analytics platform. And what we mean by that is under the hood storage is the OneLake. It's like a logical storage solution. So you don't often see OneLake within the user interface. You will see OneLake Explorer and OneLake Hub and things like that. But OneLake itself is very much kind of like software-defined storage, really. It allows us to put all our different capacities and have that storage available across all the different workspaces, and we call it One Lake. We've also got the ability to tie in with governance solutions being Purview, but once we're within Fabric, we have the different experiences. This changed over time. You used to be able to see these as menu options. Now you basically see Power BI or Fabric as your different experience selector. But within Fabric itself, you're going to be looking at things like Data Factory, which is your data engineering, data flow Gen 2, or your data pipelines. You've got the data engineering workload, which will be the ability to do notebooks. Notebooks kind of applies across the board because you can do it in data science as well. With data warehouse, that is the Fabric data warehouse, very similar to just working with a database technology, but under the hood, it's going to be Delta Parquet files. Data science being notebooks, ML experience, and environments. With real-time intelligence, that's where we're looking at things like Event House, Event Stream, KQL databases, the KQL language, that's where that sits. And of course, Data Activator, which is a product that's somewhat unique to Microsoft Fabric. You don't see Data Activator and the reflex items in any other Microsoft product. Power BI, tried and tested, it's about to turn 10, if I remember correctly. So it's been around for a little while. That's our visualization product. It also has things like the Data Mart, but that's kind of, don't use that one if you haven't already used it because it's not really getting any love. And then partner and industry workloads is something that's new. Copilot, like all the other Microsoft products, Fabric also has a Copilot. I think if I remember, it has at least 5 different Copilot experiences, and they're adding more and more all the time. But that's our overarching surface area for Microsoft Fabric. It is software as a service. Outside of this visual and these interfaces within Fabric, the capacities are provisioned on the Azure side. So within the Azure portal, you can provision a resource type of Fabric capacity. That's where the capacities are, with the exception of if you engage a trial within Fabric, you only see that capacity within Fabric itself. You don't see it on the Azure side. So that's the overarching thing. We have everything in one, and the idea is that all the different personas, whether you're a data engineer, network engineer, data analyst, data scientist, any other data prefixed role within your organization, can work in the same platform. It means we're not having to copy all the data around because we are looking to use the One Lake underpinning storage. But you can't just say, hey, Fabric, I want to give One Lake some files. You have to use one of the experiences to get within that storage engine. So Martin, I think we mentioned the term native. Native store for us is like it's built into the product as opposed to leveraging an external storage. But native, you won't see in the documentation. You don't look up native storage and find that in the docs. But I think, Martin, you're going to go into more detail on what we mean by those specifically.
I am indeed, Heidi. Yeah. So we've got a fair bit of choice in the platform, and most people who've been within a lake house before, you might look at it and think, oh, that looks exactly the same as a warehouse. Kind of what's the difference? So both a SQL warehouse and a SQL lakehouse, you can connect to them with a SQL endpoint. So you can use Management Studio or Azure Data Studio, which is now getting deprecated, and you can connect to the endpoint with both of those tools. However, with a lakehouse, you can only query data. The endpoint is read-only. With a warehouse, you can connect to it with the SQL endpoint, and you can do all the things that most of the things that you're used to doing with a SQL database. The SQL surface area isn't exactly the same with a warehouse, but it's very, very similar. And most of the things you can do within SQL, you can do with a warehouse, but not the complete set. Now, so the lakehouse, you can read from it with SQL, but you can't write to it. So what do you use to write to it? And there would you use Spark SQL, or you could use PySpark or one of the other languages that comes along with the Spark set. Spark SQL itself is very similar to T-SQL. It's more ANSI-SQL, so it hasn't got the T-SQL extensions that you're probably really used to if you've been playing in that space for a while. The main difference, I kind of think, between the warehouse and the lakehouse, you can store any kind of files in the lakehouse. You can store CSV files, video files, any kind of files you want, pictures, anything. It's got a file section, and you have to set that up and put your files in there, but you can drag them over, and you can, if the CSV files, for example, in there, you can turn them into tables within the Lakehouse. We'll have a look at all this shortly. Now I'll jump ahead and go SQL on Fabric. So SQL on Fabric is essentially Azure SQL within Fabric. So it's the SQL server that we all know and love. Now that is probably one of the only stores that doesn't go through to OneLake itself natively. It's basically the normal storage that we associate with Azure SQL behind the scenes. However, it does have a second endpoint. So you can connect to the first endpoint just with Management Studio and input, output data freely as you would. The second endpoint is actually mirrored to the warehouse, and that is actually a read-only endpoint. And that lets you do operations on it, which you might want to go to your analytics and things like that. The other one is an event house. So what's an event house? It's kind of a new word if you've never really heard it before. And that's where our real-time data will come through to. So that will come through to what we call a Kusto database. It's based on the Kusto query language, which is very, very similar to SQL. Once you start getting into some more gnarly parts of it, it kind of starts not looking like SQL. But for the most part, if you're beginning and just reading data, it does look a lot like SQL. The data there goes into a KQL database, and the KQL data isn't reflected in OneLake itself. However, you do have the option to put it into a Lakehouse additionally, where the Lakehouse itself sits on top of OneLake. So we haven't listed OneLake specifically here, but basically all of the data stores get their data from OneLake, which is sitting there in Delta Parquet format, and that's like the unifying layer. We mentioned something about external data stores, so you can actually mirror different external data sources straight into Fabric, and we got some examples there with Azure SQL and Cosmos, which obviously sit on the Azure system, but we also got Snowflake. I think you can do Databricks now. And apart from that, you can also shortcut to data that exists in external stores. So we've got examples there of AWS, S3, we've got GCP, and there's quite a few other ones coming along all the time. So that's just a quick introduction, Heidi. Let's drill into some of those in a bit more detail.
Yeah, so with the external data stores, the most common usage pattern here is when you've already got an existing data estate, whether it's yours and other teams or an external organization. So you can do shortcuts to a number of things, and that's kind of like virtualized data. So with that shortcut, it's not copying the data into the OneLake. So it's important to notice the difference between accessing data and actually copying data into OneLake. So in this case, we're just accessing the data on an external storage location. So if we were doing an existing Synapse data estate or a Databricks where we've got the data stored in ADLS Gen 2, we can shortcut from a Fabric Lakehouse over to those storage locations. We can also do it to S3 storage. So if you are doing on-premises with S3 or you've got AWS with S3, we can shortcut to those. And then, of course, Snowflake. And there is also Dataverse, which I haven't included in here. Dataverse itself has the ability to use shortcuts as well. Other than the key thing being those shortcuts are virtualized, they also don't have the same performance as if you were to copy the data in. So Fabric excels on the data when one of its engines are writing the data to the OneLake because it's able to put the different V ordering and things on. With a shortcut, because we're accessing the data over where the other solution has written it, then we're accessing it as more of a virtualized. So we don't get all the different performance gains that we have with having the data in the OneLake. It does mean we can still use it, but for things like Databricks as well, the security is not copied over. So when we do a shortcut security, the Lakehouse is saying, hey, I want to define this table to be this Parquet file in this ADLS Gen 2 location. It doesn't mean if there's a Databricks sitting on top of that the Unity catalog security then applies over on the Fabric side. It means you have to recreate the security you want. So often the access to the file itself is going to be through either like a service principal or one of those mediums. So it's kind of like that single authentication through. And then you need to secure the lakehouse to have that more granular control if you don't want everyone that's got access to that lakehouse to get access to that shortcut. The shortcuts are predominantly read shortcuts. I believe there is one scenario where it is a read write. So be careful when you do hit the delete key. But for the most part, they are read. So having the shortcut in the lakehouse doesn't mean you can manipulate the data at the other end of that shortcut. It just means it's surfacing it into the lakehouse itself. I think, Martin, you're going to talk to us about more on those shortcuts, but also the fact that we've got caching involved as well.
Yeah, that's right, Heidi. So I think the best way to talk about this is to just dive into maybe a quick demo. So I will share my screen here, share my entire screen, and away we go. So let me know if you can see my screen there.
Yep, we got the PowerPoint, the full window.
PowerPoint, yeah, okay. So we're going to look at what we call shortcutting here. So if we don't have the data within our lakehouse, so at the moment we're looking at a lakehouse here. It looks very much like SQL. Basically, we've got tables up here. However, we've got a file section down here, and we can see within my tables here, I've got 5 tables, but I'm actually lacking some data that I want. I want a sales table in here. Now, the sales table could exist in a CSV file on like Azure Data Lake Gen 2. It could exist in Snowflake, could exist anywhere. For the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to say it actually exists in a second lakehouse, which is in a brand new workspace. So it's outside of the workspace we've got. It's still within Fabric, but it's in a different workspace. I chose to do this rather than mess around with security, going off to different external sources, but the concept is really the same. So we want to reflect that as a table within our lakehouse. So we just click on here, we say we want a new table shortcut, and I've got this in Lakehouse 2, which is in a different workspace. So I'll just pick this in Microsoft OneLake. Obviously I could pick a few other stores there as well, but I'll just pick OneLake. And this is where I've got it here. It's in a workspace called Data Plateau. The workspace I am actually in is called Data Plateau 1, and we have the file in there. So I'll just click on there and select Next. We go to the tables, and we'll see within this lakehouse, I've got one table, and that is sales. So I'm going to highlight it. I'm going to click Next, and it's going to create. And over here now, we should see the sales table there. Note that it's got a slightly different icon. There, you'll see it's got like a little chain above the top to indicate that it is a virtualized table. Basically, it is a shortcut. But for all intents and purposes, we can look at this. It is taking a little bit of time to load. But for all intents and purposes, it is accessible as a table within this lakehouse itself. And if I'd joined to something else outside, you'd see it in exactly the same way. Now, all the tables here are all in Delta Parquet format. I could have done exactly the same thing with a file. I could right click there. I could set a new shortcut up, and the file would be seen in exactly the same way in this lakehouse as the table is being seen. So that's a quick demo on the lakehouse shortcuts, Heidi. I'll just stop sharing my screen, and you can go back over to your screen if you want. Well, obviously, I think you probably should. But that's a quick demo on shortcutting. Mirroring itself, yeah, it's a bit of not an unfortunate name. It obviously does what it says. It mirrors. It's not the same as SQL mirroring. It's not as fully featured. It's essentially just replicating your source system to OneLake. So when something changed in the source system, the change should be reflected in the destination. So that's my demo and a quick recap on shortcuts and mirroring, Heidi.
Yeah, 2 extra things to add there. So the shortcuts, the reason we point those out, they're only available currently today in the Lakehouse. So if you want to leverage shortcuts for any of your data solutions, then you're going to need to either introduce a lakehouse or have lakehouse as part of your core. They are in the roadmap for warehouse, but you won't see them in the other ones at the moment. So be mindful of that. Also, if you're doing mirroring, mirroring creates its own item type. So if, for example, you were setting up your bronze layer in a medallion where you're copying your sources in, you could have a combination of lakehouses with shortcuts, lakehouses pulling in unstructured data into files, but also have those mirrored databases as well, copying those data sources that you might have in a supported format. Most of them are in preview, and also check for data type support, because not all the mirroring supports all the data types that those external solutions offer. So for example, early on when you're looking at geography and geometry data types in SQL Server, you wouldn't necessarily see those come over in the mirroring. So make sure you always look at the supported feature set for what you want to do. And the other use case that is quite common for shortcuts is your data scientists, where you've got a data platform solution, but you don't want to give them access to everything to do a hypothesis test. You can create a separate lakehouse shortcut over certain tables from your enterprise data platform, and then restrict that separate lakehouse just to your data science group so they can work with the same data without you copying it around everywhere, but allows it just to be a subset.
Good stuff, Heidi. How else can we maybe move data into our data stores?
Please, you asked there. Courtesy of awesome Fabric Cat team member Darren Gospel, he actually put together this slide back in April 2024 when they were doing the Fabric Cat road trip around Australia. We've just enhanced it a little bit with the extra changes that are going on. The reason we call out the different ways you can acquire data into Fabric is because the different options limit what data storage you're going to do. And when you attach that also to your networking restrictions, so if, for example, you're trying to copy from AWS Gen 2 behind private endpoints, you can't necessarily do, say, private endpoints and use pipelines, but you can do private endpoints and use notebooks. So the ingestion pattern that you're going to use and the technology that you use to support that changes based on what you want to do, whether it be network controls, your destination is a Fabric storage option, or just your general business capability. If you've got business users that need to upload, say, a CSV of the latest, finance information or a chart of accounts, they can use things like the OneLake File Explorer to just straight load data into that lakehouse, into the file section, or it might be you're working with data engineers who can use things like AZ Copy to copy files in, or you're doing something different and you might have semantic models existing in your Power BI estate that you want to then make sure that that same Power BI semantic model is also surfaced as Delta Parquet, or as Greg says, or use the real ADF. That's very true. Something to note, you'll see Data Factory, you'll see terminology that's very similar to Azure. So Data Factory, Azure Data Factory Pipelines, Fabric Data Factory. They are not one-for-one the same. They don't have the feature parity of being the same. And that goes for the features within the product, but also ancillary things like source control and versioning management. They're not the same. So be mindful why the terminology looks the same, as we pointed out with mirroring. Same term, different use case, different outcomes, different limitations. So always check the Fabric specific ones. And anytime you're searching for Fabric, chuck Microsoft on the front so that you actually get the technology data solution, not, the industry of craft. But all these different acquisition models, other than Shortcut, which is an access approach, they're allowing us to use the Delta Parquet with the OneLake storage, and we're taking advantage of being able to write with the Fabric solutions, which means we're making the best on our performance side of the fence. So if you do start to find that you're shortcutting to, say, AWS Gen 2 where your Databricks is, and you're starting to see Power BI, really leverage that. You might want to copy that data in and have more advantages by being able to use things like Direct Lake, more advantageous. So we have at least 8, and that's only ever growing. The more mirroring thing that's come in, the more technology solutions we have. I think Shortcuts is going into real-time space as well. So it's just going to get better and better and better over time.
Great stuff. So we're now look at our native data stores, Heidi. And I think the first one we're going to come to is OneLake Unified Storage itself. So as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, all the data that you put into Fabric, apart from like videos and unstructured data and things like that, the tables themselves are Parquet formats, and they're more Delta Parquet formats. So the Delta really means that we've got, to use an analogy with SQL Server, like a SQL log. The changes are reflected in the Delta part of the Delta Parquet. So it is unified storage, and like I say, everything is reflected within OneLake. But if you want to store just standard files that aren't in Delta Parquet format, throw them into a lakehouse. Now, we've got something in here called the OneLake Storage Explorer, and that allows you to basically sync data from within your Fabric workspace over to your local desktop. Works very similar to how a OneDrive works, and you might have heard like the marketing people talk about OneLake as being the OneDrive for data. It's kind of quite useful if you're developing and you need like a quick way of getting data up to your workspace, or you want to pull it across to your desktop. But maybe in a production scenario that doesn't quite work as well as you might think. Obviously, you don't want your desktop to be swamped with loads and loads of data. But there are uses for that within production. I had one person who I let them drop a SQL file into a folder on the desktop. We just sync across to the lakehouse, and then we could do whatever we needed to do within the lakehouse and within Fabric to that file. So it's definitely a useful thing to do. That side kind of simplifies data management and enhances the accessibility. There is a roadmap here for what we're calling One Security, which is the security model that applies to OneLake in general. And that security model will be honored by all of the other engines, so the lakehouse and the warehouse and any other engine that talks to OneLake. So that's OneLake Storage Explorer, Heidi.
Unmute helps if I unmute. The other thing we do is underneath all this is of course the Delta Parquet. So Microsoft made a decision a couple of years ago when they were building out Fabric to go with an open source format. It kind of helps with that whole better together story. So everything except for Fabric SQL on Fabric. So then one of the more newer items to the Fabric platform is using that Parquet storage under the hood, which means we get that columnar storage. We can get fast performance when we're using things like Spark. We also have the ability to use the Delta Lake concept as well, so we can get all the assets. We can do scheme reinforcement. We can do time travel. Be mindful, time travel is not going to be like to the beginning of time per se, but we can do things like that. So using Delta Parquet under the hood means that we can do more of that cross-platform analytical platforms, because things like the AWS space already using Delta Parquet. Synapse was using Delta Parquet. We have Databricks, Delta Parquet. So by using those consistently, we introduce it over into Fabric. The thing is, though, everyone does their own flavor on top of that Delta Parquet. So Microsoft has the things about V-ordering. Databricks has their special flavor of thing to have that competitive advantage. So you won't get every single feature that comes out in the open source available in Fabric straight away, and you won't get the competitive stuff. So if Databricks is doing something, don't naturally expect that Fabric has it unless it's part of the open source solution that's available to all vendors. But what they've also done more recently is start to support Iceberg. So Iceberg is of course Snowflake's data type format under the hood. So there's more support for that coming into Fabric, which means you can also work better with Snowflake across the Fabric. So by way of doing shortcuts and or ingesting in that data or having Snowflake write to it. A lot of people get confused when they look at Databricks, how it integrates with Fabric. It does have a number of different ways. You can have Databricks writing to Fabric, Fabric reading from Databricks, so you've got the hybrid scenario, or you can migrate over by shifting your data engineering solutions over to Fabric. Great way to do it if, of course, you're already using Power BI to ingest from Databricks. Hybridize first by using shortcuts, and then shift your data engineering workload over and shift entirely, or keep both data estates. And as Greg pointed out in the chat, data types and naming is a real issue when it comes to using Delta Parquet. So be mindful of that. Not all the data types are supported when you're working with Parquet. Very different to when we were working with SQL or Oracle. We had a definitive list, and we sort of have patterns to be able to convert between the two platforms, and even Postgres as well, and Mongo and other platforms. Now having Parquet as being a more industry recognized for data lake solutions, we have another challenge around what data types are supported as we're ingesting in our data. And often you'll find converting almost just anything that you're going to bring into strings seems to be the common pattern that occurs. And yeah, SQL and Fabric. An event house, while it stores it in a KQL database, it can also replicate that data to Parquet. So you can work with it with the KQL language, but you can also work with it in the Parquet format as well, with that SQL endpoint style of strategy. But let's look more around Lakehouse.
Yeah, so what exactly is a lakehouse? So the lakehouse architecture, it kind of merges the capabilities of a data lake with the capabilities of a warehouse. So we've seen earlier, we've got those two nodes in there. We've got the tables node to just list the tables, and they are in fact in Delta Parquet format under the covers. And then we got the file section where you can like literally drop anything you want in there. It is optional. Well, it is optimal for building like the medallion architecture. So what is the medallion architecture? Well, it's probably a fancy name for an architecture that most people on this call would have been dealing with for the last 10, 20 years, or however long they've been around data warehousing. Essentially, we're landing data in one area, we're maybe curating it in a second area, and we're putting it into the final version in the third area. So the medallion architecture kind of terms that bronze, silver, and gold. You might term it like staging, curated, and gold, or whatever it is. Or you might have your own terminology indeed for those little three areas. It does offer a lot of flexibility. I know the point's been made about some of the data types. One of the things that's caught me out in the past is there are some data types within SQL Server, I'm sure other platforms, that don't translate one-to-one onto Fabric. An example might be the geo data types within SQL. There's now kind of match for them within Fabric. So do watch out for things like that. Also, we talked about naming as well. I brought an Excel file across fairly recently, and I decided in my infinite wisdom that I'd make the columns in my lakehouse have exactly the same names as the columns in the Excel file. Unfortunately, all the columns in the Excel file, or not all of them, but most of them, things like spaces in and slashes in, and characters that weren't really accepted in the Delta Parquet world. Now, obviously, there are ways of getting around that by escaping things like in SQL, you wrap it in square brackets and things like that. Similar kind of thing, although not exactly the same in the Parquet world. But yeah, prefer to maybe deal with that a different way. But just watch out for things like that. And it's ideal for like the machine learning architecture where it's optimized for analytics. But do watch out that, like we said before, you can access it with SQL, read-only endpoints. If you want to do any kind of data manipulation in there, you're probably going to be going into the Spark SQL world, which is similar to T-SQL, but not exactly the same. I found one of the big issues I found was the merge statements. The merge statement within Spark SQL didn't kind of work exactly the same as it does within T-SQL, because obviously T-SQL's got a few enhancements built around it, and things like that may catch you out in time. And keep your eye on the roadmap here. For schema support has just been brought in to the Lakehouse, so it's still in preview. I think it's probably a pretty solid preview feature, but some places don't like using preview features. But I tend to use that all the time. So what have we got on the warehouse, Heidi?
Of course, the warehouse doesn't really get much airtime these days. It's an interesting conversation we had at FabCon back in Las Vegas a couple of months back, where everyone's like, why don't you use the warehouse? And one of the core reasons is because a lot of the Microsoft documentation about adapting or adopting Fabric in your organization and implementing medallion architectures points you solely towards Lakehouse. So one of the myths, I guess, that's happening with the Fabric platform is that warehouse is suited to a number of different use cases. The key one that gets called out often is the fact that warehouse does support a lot of the SQL capability, the T-SQL capability. So if you've got a lot of users within your organization that are in your engineering or you have DBA skill sets, then the warehouse might be an item that is better suited to your support mechanism. So better suited to your engineers, as opposed to getting them to learn to write Spark and do read-only SQL endpoints as opposed to read-write. Whereas warehouse, having both the read-write, having the ability to take existing solutions. So you would have seen announced recently also the preview around migrations from Synapse to Fabric Warehouse, because we can take a lot of the SQL code that's happening with Synapse, move it over. We can take existing data solutions on SQL Server where they've got stored procedures and functions and take those and move them over to Warehouse. Of course, not every single T-SQL option is supported. So it's important to look at, I think the docs is called T-SQL Surface Area within Fabric, and look for anywhere it says SQL Analytic Endpoint, because the SQL Analytic Endpoint is appropriate to both. The difference with Warehouse is it has the two. It has the read-write one as well as the read-only one. So Warehouse you predominantly work with SQL. I believe, if I remember correctly, there's some preview spaces with Spark working with Warehouse. But Warehouse allows you to do all of your medallion architecture if you want to, with the exception of files. So the two callouts doesn't support files. So your unstructured data, you have to move into a more structured sense. And then your shortcutting capability is not currently within Warehouse, but keep an eye on the roadmap for different changes in the shortcut space as well. But everything else basically says in the docs, use Lakehouse, Lakehouse, Lakehouse. But when you actually look at what the Warehouse functionality is capable of, you'll find that Warehouse is quite a good mechanism to go to. If you're doing things like metadata-driven ETL solutions, your Warehouse may become your config database. If you're doing master data management and you want to have the ability to put data in a tabular format and have it read-write editable with multiple approaches, then Warehouse also works for that. It's now getting stiff competition from Fabric on SQL if you're using it for app-based data storage. If you're looking to do AI, whether it used to be Fabric AI Skill, now is Data Agent, you can look to use Warehouse and things as well. But Warehouse, I think, is still going to be predominant for those with SQL skill sets in their organization looking to stay in that space. But it does have the ability to use solutions across the two. So Lakehouse and Warehouse means you can have a warehouse that queries a Lakehouse, similar to three-part naming, which you might have seen if you work with SQL Server. You can do that within Warehouse. But also Warehouse is getting massive changes in its performance techniques. And I forget the exact stats that was shown a couple of months ago by some of the executives, but Warehouse itself was rapidly increasing in its performance. It is not perfect. Definitely test your workloads through it. Any solution, whilst Microsoft will provide things like white papers, they'll provide you statistics on baselines where they've run performance benchmarks on it. Those are using like cookie cutter pre-canned tests that might not be the exact model of your data. So it's important anytime you are going to look to use any of the Fabric items that you put through a performance benchmark that's more appropriate to your test, whether you're doing a series of small data loads or whether you're doing like terabyte, petabyte scale data loads through. Make sure that the workload you pick is going to be appropriate for that. There's some more toggles coming in when it comes to the warehouse, whether it goes to like a certain node. They have sort of background and foreground nodes. I forget the exact terminology. JPod would kill me for not knowing that off the top of my head. But they are making improvements in the node that it picks to run your test. But it is getting better. And the other thing, it has better security than Lakehouse. I say better because it has more granular security, because we can do schema level security. Row level, column level is still a thing. We can use it to work with Power BI and do Direct Lake as well. But there are certain things that it can do in the security space that are coming with one security, but that's still in preview. So if you want to do that schema level control and have schemas that are not in preview, that are in GA, then Warehouse might be the appropriate candidate for you. All right.
Right, Fabric notes, Heidi. I think we've called these Fabric notes because we've borrowed some other slides to compare a Lakehouse and a Warehouse, because for a lot of part-time they are very, very similar. But when should you choose one over another? Obviously, the data volume's there. No benefit over one or the other. But the Lakehouse can do semi-structured data and unstructured data as well. It's got that file section where you can put whatever you like in there. The Warehouse is really your traditional data warehouse, which your developers and your SQL engineers are going to be perfectly at home with, whereas like your data scientists doing machine learning and AI and that sort of thing might be more at home with the Lakehouse. And the Lakehouse, you know, you can interact with that more with PySpark and Spark, and you know the other languages like Scala and R. Although R's tending not to be used so much nowadays, I see. Just my personal opinion. There was a time where it was used a lot. I see that becoming less and less now. But the primary skill set within the warehouse is obviously the SQL, and that reason itself might be, you know, a high factor in why you might choose one over the other. Although I would say that the upskilling part of learning PySpark or Spark SQL is not really that steep at all. Like, you know, I did find PySpark a little bit gnarly to start off with, but once you're in there and you can find your way around, you should probably have no problem, especially if you've got maybe a C# background or a programming background. Like that. The data concepts are pretty much the same. You know, if you're merging data, if you're selecting data, the syntax is different, but you should pick it up quite well. So the T-SQL coverage is obviously great within the warehouse, maybe not so great within the Lakehouse. And like I say, the SQL endpoint is limited and is read only. Now, transactions are a big deal here. Obviously, a transaction with inside SQL, big tick, we can do transactions, no problem. The docs say you can do transactions in a Lakehouse on a single table. I found that a bit tricky, but you certainly can't do them across multiple tables, and you can obviously do that with ease within a SQL Server itself. The Lakehouse can obviously have files. It can ingest files, put them to tables, use them as data sources. Whereas, like, we can do that in the warehouse too, but you're looking at probably things like external tables and learning the SQL to actually do that. I know there's people who use external tables quite a lot, and they were used in Synapse extensively. Well, in my experience, they were, but I haven't seen them used so much in the warehouses here. But you know, that's just my view. So, can we query across lakehouses and warehouses? Yes, we can. Just using like three-part naming, like we do in traditional SQL Server. So that's the warehouse. See, there's some really large comments being wrote. I'll have a read of them while you go on to the next slide, Heidi.
That's all right, because those comments were from me.
Oh, right, okay.
The short answer is it depends on that one. So when we talk about the two SQL endpoints that are available, so by default, anytime you create a Lakehouse warehouse item within Microsoft Fabric, it also spins up a SQL endpoint, which is the read-only one, as well as the default semantic model, which also has its own gotchas. That default one would recommend always creating your own semantic model if you're using semantic modeling. But with the SQL endpoint on the Lakehouse, of course, we can do things like we can go create views on top of that, but that's the extent to which we can basically do those write operations. Anytime we want to work with the data, we've basically got to use Spark if we want to do any write operations, whereas the read we can do on both. We can use the SQL endpoint for Lakehouse or Warehouse to create views, and we can use it to query the data in a SQL format. But as soon as we want to use SQL to do write operations, we have to use Warehouse. So when we want to do store procedures, functions, and just generally use SQL to move the data around and transform the data, then Warehouse is the go-to for that. When it comes to the ingestion options, we can use shortcuts only in Lakehouse, not in Warehouse. Note check roadmap. For things like Spark, we can preview it on the Warehouse side, as in it's a preview feature. It's not there, but we can use it on the Lakehouse side. And Pipelines does support both, but Pipelines is more for strict data movement. It's basically like a copy job. Data movement and orchestration. When you want to do that transformation, you either want to use things like store procedures and functions, or you want to use Spark to do more of the transformation stuff. Or if you're a low-code, no-coder citizen dev, Dataflow Gen 2 on the Lakehouse side and Dataflow Gen 2 on the data warehouse side. Medallion is supported for both. Medallion, as Martin pointed out, is more of a marketing architecture or marketer. And if you want to have fun with people, just start talking about different layers that aren't in the general one. So where it says bronze, silver, and gold, just throw in a few other ones, like what's your platinum layer, what's your diamond layer, what's your emerald layer, just for a bit of fun. Mention other ones and see what happens. Some organizations do have that. They go, oh, diamond is our semantic model. But everyone gets a bit confused because they think it's a strict thing, but it's really just marketing architecture. If you want to replace that with its former predecessor, you'd probably say operational data store, integrated data layer, and then either enterprise data layer or reporting layer or something to that effect. Before data lake architectures exist, that was a common thing in business intelligence solutions. So the way to access these endpoints, if you go into the Lakehouse via the UI, you get the little top right drop down and will say Lakehouse Explorer, switch that to SQL Analytic Endpoint, and that will then give you the T-SQL query surface area inside the browser. If you go into either of them and hit the little gear icon by either being Lakehouse or Warehouse, hit the little gear icon and look for SQL Analytic Endpoint, and it'll give you this lovely looking connection string, which is effectively a GUID of the workspace plus the endpoint. Fun fact is if you have multiple lakehouses sitting in the one workspace, you can query across them. So if you connect to one of them with SSMS or Azure Data Studio or VS Code or any other query tool you like, it's kind of like looking at it in an instance view, that workspace level. You can see the multiple storage points within and query across them. Rare use case where someone wants to compare their bronze to silver to gold. Often happens when you're troubleshooting a problem though. So be mindful of that. Rather than use the browser one, you can switch into a client tool, connect to using the SQL endpoint and query across them. And we do point out Fabric Notes. It is something that Microsoft provides. So if you go aka.ms/Fabric Notes, there's various people within Microsoft who put together these little one pages of different things. So we've shown you 2 of them. I think there's at least 10 sitting in their GitHub repo of all different little tips and tricks. And they call this the 3 dot. I refer to it as 3-part naming. But where you put the Lakehouse dot, the schema dot, the object. Yes, Lakehouse, even though schema is in preview, pretty much everything sits in DBO before that. And you can not use the schema when you're referencing it. But I think just for completeness, use the schema. And of course in warehouse it's the same, so you can do data warehouse.schema.object name on the end of it. But if we circle back now to our main deck or our main presentation,
and what slide we're going into, our slide about Event House, Heidi. So real-time data handling. So the Event House itself, it does excel at handling real-time data. So where will we getting our real-time data from feeds from maybe utility companies, electricity meters, anything that's coming across in a continuous stream, rather than we're just grabbing it periodically and pulling it in. So it could be coming out as real fast, and we need to ingest it quickly. It could be coming out periodically, but there's that stream of data coming in, and we need to read it. So we'd set up our event stream, which would catch the data, and then we'd have to feed it in. Well, we don't have to, we probably would feed it into our KQL database, and we'll do that. We can analyze the data as it passes through from our stream to our event house. We can also put that data to a lakehouse if we want to store it. Well, be stored in a KQL database anyway, but maybe we want to store it in the lakehouse as well, where it can go through into that Delta Parquet format. So Event House supports event-based architecture and allows the systems to react to the incoming data. We might want to look for anomaly detection. I might want to look for high values or low values, and we do that with KQL. If anyone's used any monitoring tools within Azure, probably be familiar with the KQL language. It's kind of wrote. It's very similar to SQL, but it's not exactly the same. Each line returns a data set, and then the next line works on that data set, returns a data set, the next line returns, and so on and so forth until you get to the data set you actually want, and then you can output that in real time. So obviously you can use that as a query language as well. People who are used to using Synapse and that in the past might have used Stream Analytics and that, and that was in the Synapse world. In this world, we're going on KQL. So that's real time, Heidi.
Excellent summary there. Never thought I'd do much with real time, but I definitely think if you're looking to do the DP 700 exam, the data engineer one, definitely look at real time. And also within the real time platform, if you're doing any monitoring or auditing of the Fabric platform itself, there is a built-in event stream for Fabric events. So it's similar to what you might have seen previously for Power BI going to the Office 365 activity log. Within the event stream, it'll store things like created an item of a particular item type, changed access, those sort of things. So you can straight away start auditing your platform with that built-in event stream there. Now, SQL on Fabric, if I remember correctly, got announced November last year at Chicago Ignite. So it's still a bit of a young item within the platform. It's still in preview. It is your solution to transactional database, because whilst they wanted to make Fabric initially it was the analytic platform of choice, now it's become the just data platform of choice. So whether you're doing analytics and using one of the other items, or whether you're doing transactional and app dev work, then you can still use SQL on Fabric. So it's a transactional database. It's suitable for using with apps. Straightforward to set up. Make sure it's in your region. Not all regions have all Fabric items. And be mindful of the region of host versus region of capacity. For this one, it's region of host. So you want to check your host solution is in a supported region, and then your capacity is in a supported region. It does allow you to take the data. It is stored in sort of your MDF, LDF data storage points. So it's not natively in the Parquet format, but you can replicate your transactional database into that OneLake Parquet format, so you can work with it with the other solutions. It also has a SQL Analytic endpoint and the default semantic model, and does allow you to connect to it with the client tooling. So I think where Fabric SQL is mainly going to apply is solutions where you might have built, say, Power Apps platforms on top. You might want to store them. If Dataverse is giving you some limitations, look to use something like SQL on Fabric, because you have the ability to go between Dataverse and Fabric with different offerings. If you're looking to do app-based development, because Fabric does have things like GraphQL and everything, so you might want to do your app-based development and apply solutions with apps in Fabric, and then having your data already in the OneLake ecosystem means you can seamlessly take your transactional data and put it in your analytical space. And as Darren's pointed out there, the transanalytical stuff that's coming in, transanalytical flows, I think is its name, where you can do Power BI with write back. So have a look at SQL on Fabric for more your transactional workloads. It could also be your config database for metadata-driven pipeline solutions, or it could be your storage for master data management, where you want to do that. But it is, it's in preview, Greg. Transanalytical, I think it's called transanalytical flows preview. But thanks for double checking. So yeah, SQL on Fabric, and of course, like all the other solutions, it's got a little bit of Copilot going in there to help you write your SQL queries or help you explain your SQL queries. So it still has Copilot available to us as well. Anything you want to add on that one, Martin?
No, I just like the name Translytical. It's I just want to do something with it because it's translytical, basically.
All right.
But I think the next slide is probably a quick one, Heidi. It's just really about, the fact that I think we've already touched on it. We can combine, data from the lake house, the warehouse, the event house. Obviously, it's all within OneLake itself. So combining that is pretty simple. So how do we evaluate these storage-based usage patterns?
One of the biggest things is to look at what are you trying to store in it. So separate to whole medallion architecture, separate to what's the skill set of your team, is what is the type of data that you want to work with. So if you're looking at working with structured data, of course, the obvious one is to put it in a Fabric SQL database, but you can also put it in Lakehouse and Warehouse. So the immediate thing with structured data is it doesn't rule out any of the products. So straight away, we know if we're working with structured, we can basically go in all of them, with the exception of Event House, because it's more your event stream data. When we're talking about unstructured is where it's going to be a delineator to go for Lakehouse, because Lakehouse is the one that'll support us putting videos in, supporting images in, supporting, blocks of text files in, because we have the ability to store files. It means we can still work with them with the different ingestion solutions and then shift the aspects that we need to a structured one. But immediately, if we want unstructured data, we're going to go with Lakehouse. And the important thing is to pick the thing that's right for you. So you can use a combination of, you can put all your data estate in one, you can go across a number of them. It really just depends on what you're trying to achieve. I know with some orgs, they're going, oh, do I do one lake house for my bronze, another one for silver, another one for gold? And then do I put them in separate workspaces, or do I put them in the same workspace? Do I go for warehouse and put schemas in as my separation? It really depends on all the different factors. So data type is one of them. And then we're going to talk about some of the other ones next that are differentiating. So it's never a cookie cutter single decision of this is the one way to do it. It's not like we can, throw in the sort of Star Wars references and go, this is the way, because it really just depends on all the different factors put together as to which way you go with, and tying that to the limitations today, which are different to the limitations in 6 months' time.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that depends on security as well. That'd be one of the big points, Heidi, there. But going on to batch processing versus real-time processing here. So I think, really two very different kind of ways of dragging data in. And it'd probably be obvious that your data is sitting over here, it's static, it's in another database, in a data source. So you want to grab that periodically, and that's going to be your batch processing. Whereas if you have got a real-time stream, it's going to be pretty obvious that you've got one, and you'll need to pull that in because it'll be coming at you pretty quickly, and you'll need something to ingest it, your event stream, and take action on the data as it comes in. You might want to do that, or you might just want to land the data and then look at it. It depends on what sort of pattern you are going to choose. But the choice between real time and batch processing, I guess that depends on the specific needs of the organization. You can even hook real time up with like CDC from SQL Server and use it like that. So I guess that's kind of graying the area between batch and real time, but it kind of gives you a few options. And we've got a caution note on the bottom there. What does that say, Heidi? Ingestion approach may also limit impact selection. Yep, pipelines. You've also got data flow Gen 2s. We mentioned at the start. You've got notebooks, mirroring, shortcut. So you've got a lot of choice for batch data. You haven't got so much choice for the real-time data. Does that make sense, Heidi? Should we move on?
Yeah, the other reason we put that caution is early on there was some limitations around, let's say you did a pipeline in one workspace and then you wanted to transform the data and put it in a lakehouse or a warehouse in another workspace. Not all the ingestion patterns supported all the different destinations, let alone the destinations going across workspaces. And then when it comes to networking, not all the different networking controls that you can use in conjunction with Fabric are supported by all the items. So it gets very much a spaghetti diagram. For example, private endpoints is supported by Spark and notebooks. I think it's getting better with pipelines, but not so much. Whereas then pipelines, you can use whitelisting on things like storage accounts, but then that requires different networking controls on your storage account that some orgs don't like. So the different options are limited. So you've got to take into account all the different layers as to which one is going to be right for you or which combination is going to be right. And to that point, we also talk about visualization. So when we're looking at doing reporting of some of these storage solutions, we of course can do the direct lake mode, which is the new one. I think about direct lake as basically the refreshless solution. So as the data sits into that lakehouse and warehouse and event house, we can automatically be reporting straight off that without having to do a semantic model refresh. We didn't call this out earlier, but the SQL Analytic endpoint can have a bit of a delay between getting the data, and they've introduced the ability to call a REST API to sort of basically force that refresh. So watch out for that if you are looking at data in the Spark access points and then you switch to SQL and you notice the data's not there yet. It's probably because it's still refreshing it through. So that's one of the issues with the SQL Analytic endpoint. We can also, when we're doing real-time visualization, we can look to go direct query or direct lake. But if we're doing analytical reporting where we might want to do, the day's data set as opposed to near real-time or immediate, we can look at going a combination of all the different options. So it just depends whether you want to do direct lake or not. If you've already got Power BI solutions today, Don't just go with the rose-colored glasses and the unicorn approach of let's move everything to Direct Lake. Look at whether it's appropriate to you. If you've currently got a semantic model that's importing data once a day and that's suiting your business purpose, then there's not exactly a critical, what do they call it? A critical argument to shift over to Direct Lake just because it's the new shiny thing out there in the world. But Direct Lake also has limitations. If you put things like row level security on your data storage, then Direct Lake kind of falls back to Direct Query in a number of instances. If you put views on top of your Direct Lake, views on top of your Lakehouse or Warehouse, Direct Lake kind of goes away and becomes Direct Query. So the number of limitations with that fallback mechanism from Direct Lake to Direct Query will also influence your choice. But if you need to do real-time reporting, look at Direct Lake, but also look at using Event House and having those streaming data sets and doing it real time off those. But otherwise, you might be appropriate to still stick with import mode, or it might still be appropriate to stick with Direct Query. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve. I know for sure if you're using Power BI onto Databricks, whether it's using that shortcut approach or not, you might stay wanting to use something like Direct Query, and then later down the track look at OneLink security, because you might want to pass your security all the way through to Databricks, as opposed to if you shortcut and you take out that security, then you've got to change it as well. But that's a kind of a differentiator there on the visualization layer with Power BI.
Right, let's look at some costs, Heidi. So you can do pay as you go, as you can with anything within Azure. You can also reserve capacity. I believe you can only reserve for up to 1 year at the moment, whereas you can reserve for 3 years with most Azure services. So there's obviously a sweet spot between leaving your capacity on all the time versus going reserve capacity. If you're only going to leave your capacity on for like 8 hours, maybe it's a good idea to go pay as you go, during work hours. If you're going to do something different, it's probably a good idea to look at something a little bit different. But Fabric's got something called smoothing and banding, which actually allows you to go a little bit over your capacity at times, because obviously there'll be other times where you're going a little bit under as well. So the ingress and the egress will sort of, and the capacity will even out over time. Lots of people might remember the Power BI Premium. So that's kind of equivalent to an F64. Obviously, you've got other capacity which can be used for things like Data Factory and all the other Fabric services, as well as just Power BI. And the capacity region may impact the features. Maybe not all features are available in all regions, but I don't think they'll be away from a single region for very long. They'll probably enter that region at some point. And you got the disaster recovery features by region as well. But all workloads, I think Heidi said this at the start, they all rely on capacity. And at the moment, there's no real resource governance in there. Yeah. So should we start wrapping up soon, Heidi, do you think?
Yep, we can skim this one because we've already covered it off in the already slides. But the balance between performance and scale and compute, be mindful that all the workloads you're using attached inside the workspace are going to be tied to the one capacity. That capacity has a set scale and a cost. You can, of course, scale it up or down depending on what you're doing. You can shift a workspace between one capacity to another where they're in the same region. So if for whatever reason you needed to shift your capacity, if you're taking advantage of things like that disaster recovery, make sure you do it before you start storing data so that you've got the right region for your capacity, but you can scale them up and you can pause them when you are doing the pay-as-you-go option. And definitely check out using the trial. The trial for Fabric actually spins up an F64 capacity minus Copilot functionality, if I remember correctly. So that allows you to play with it, and you don't need everyone in your org to spin up a trial. Just have one user spin up a trial and then share that capacity with the others. So because it is an F64 capacity, it's quite sizable to try things out. Doesn't need to be tied to one person. So you create multiple workspaces, give your colleagues admin access. They can then try out the features in conjunction with the tenant setting. Some other things we need to consider, Martin. Costs.
Some of the things we need to consider, costs, archiving strategies. Yeah, I guess with everything, you do need to appreciate costs, understanding what your workloads are. Using a Fabric Capacity Metrics app will give you some insight into what you're using and what your requirements are. Remember, you're probably going to need to scale as your data grows, and it's pretty crucial to plan for that scaling. In the old days, it was like, it works on my machine, but now put it into prod and it doesn't work at all. You might be trialing this with a small piece of data, and as data builds up, that's got performance implications. That's going to have impacts on your budgeting, on your long-term cost implications, and they can significantly affect your budgets. They can put you over your limits, and obviously that sort of thing can have a very negative effect on your organization as a whole. So what other stuff we got there, Heidi? Archiving and maintenance requirements.
We do indeed. What a lot of people don't think about using Fabric for is for archive. So if you've got existing data systems, whether that be you've got an application sitting on an Oracle database, or you've got some storage accounts full of files and things, consider potentially using Fabric as an archiving strategy, being able to archive your data over in Fabric. A lot of people before Fabric would use ADLS Gen 2 storage to archive data, which is great. It means your data has a storage point. You can put security on it. You can put different controls to make sure that it's secure. It's in a trustworthy state, but it doesn't have any tools to actually access and work with and query the data out of the box. You kind of have to use something. Yes, we can use things like Power BI to ingest files off of a storage account, but it's not necessarily the option we want to go for. Whereas with Fabric, by putting things in the OneLake as an archiving approach, then you can use the T-SQL endpoint, you can use the notebooks and do Spark on it, you can use KQL against it if it's that sort of storage data, or you can use Power BI. So you have that inbuilt mechanism to query that archive data as well as archiving it. And the cost of the storage may be different to what you would be using in another archiving platform. But when you think about the cost of having an archive strategy solution, as well as having the ability to access it and access it with multiple different engines and endpoints, then that's a compelling argument to potentially choose Fabric as the archive strategy for your organization. And you can do things like look at data integrity and quality and scan it into something like Purview. Good question in the chat. Can we automate purge in OneLake? Not automate by in terms of toggling a button, but you can use the ingestion solutions as well to do deletes. So if you wanted to do deletes, if you're just looking to do purge in the sense of optimizing your Parquet files, you do have the option of using the vacuum and
Optimize.
I was about to say, I'm like, it's not in my tongue. The vacuum and optimize commands. Yeah, so you can use those to take your Parquet files if you've got, tens of millions of Parquet files, or even just 10 Parquet files, and then optimize them down into sort of one or two, changing their storage footprint, but also changing their capacity and use. So that's our archiving. And like we said, you make the right choice for your organization, which changes over time. So you make the right choice today, which might be different tomorrow. I think if you want to summarize, Martin.
Yeah, too right. So it's been a bit of a long session. I think we've gone a little bit over time. Hopefully that's all right with people. So we've seen that there's quite a few external and native data stores that you can access and use within Fabric. Be aware of your data usage patterns, your structured versus unstructured, batch versus streaming. Obviously take care with your data volumes. They're going to grow over time, and select the right data store depending on the volume, and maybe you can fit it. Performance levels, obviously you need to choose the right capacity to give you the right performance, but that's going to have an impact on your data volumes, on your usage patterns, and obviously your future growth and the potential to maintain and use different Fabric features as they come in. And I don't know, I think to sum up, Heidi, I would say, Fabric's obviously it's maturing at the minute. It's not as mature as maybe Databricks or Snowflake, but it's definitely maturing. It's got a lot of potential. And if we look back where, say, Power BI was after it been around 2 years to where it is now after 10 years, that it's like chalk and cheese. And I think we're going to see that with Fabric as well. So thanks for joining us, Heidi. You got anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It is a maturing platform. There's things where if you go on it too early for the wrong thing, you're just going to be bitten and go, this is crap. So just be mindful of that, not to necessarily put everything in but the kitchen sink into it, and then have an awful experience with it. So always check that roadmap for what's coming and what's out there. If you've got a Synapse environment today, doesn't mean Synapse is going away. You can still stay with Synapse. The thing we're seeing out in the community is Synapse is still a thing. It's not deprecated, but you're not noticing a lot of improvements in that space. So if you are wanting to take advantage of a platform that's having lots of improvements, then shift over to Fabric by all means. Migration paths, you never get migration paths straight out of the box. So often you're having to migrate yourself. If you're using Databricks, like Martin said, Databricks is a very mature platform. So Snowflake, you can still stick with them and hybridize over to Fabric for your last leg, your gold layer, and then your Power BI reporting, and maybe even choose to use it for the activator feature, the ability to run alerting off your data points and be able to say, well, you know, whether your load's on point or not, whether you have a particular issue with your data that you need to trigger an alert using those sorts of features, but not necessarily the full platform. That some of those limitations, like not being able to throttle a particular workload, is frustrating, and that changes your workspace design, because suddenly if you put your data science workload and your data engineering workload together in the same workspace, and your data scientists decide to run all these things, and your capacity just hits peak, then your data engineering gets hit, or someone decides to go Copilot crazy and ask a series of prompts that just blows out your consumption units, then you kind of hit with that. And yes, we've got the Copilot capacity, but that's an F64. That's like 14 grand to have it on the whole time for an Australian business. So you got to be mindful of all those different things, but it is getting better. Fabric CLI coming in, I'm like, yes. Source control getting much better, yes. CI/CD, variabilization and parameterization. Storage is pretty safe though. Storage has got the good features, and the one lake security finally hitting a preview point. I think it was there when they originally rolled out Fabric as preview in itself.
Yeah, that's all good, Heidi. To see some great stuff. I want to thank everyone for putting comments and that and statements in the chat. I'm sure that helps everyone out. I know we're on a virtual platform, so we can't chat face to face, but the chat's been pretty active. So thanks a lot for people who've contributed there.
And thanks, Martin, for presenting, but thank Martin and Warwick for running this particular user group and making it available to everyone around the world. That's just love it.
Okay, well, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. And as Martin and Heidi have said, there's been some fantastic chat in the chat on the side for asking questions or giving comments. So that's fantastic. As I mentioned at the start of the session, this has been recorded and will be placed up onto the Data Platform YouTube channel. I did put the link in the chat. If you missed it, just scroll up and you'll be able to see that. Sign up, register, and then you'll get notifications when we do put sessions like this up on the channel, and you'll be able to come back and watch those at any time. So if there's no other questions, a big thank you to our presenters, a big thank you to you all for coming along and giving up your time to learn. And we look forward to seeing you all again for our next session.
Thanks, Warwick. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.